Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to today's workforce webinar. My name is Alec, and as usual, I'm here to help answer any of your general or technical questions that may come up. But before we get started, I'm going to cover a couple of things you need to know about the session today. There's no dial-in number for attendees. All audio will be streamed to you through your computer speakers or headphones, so please adjust your volume there accordingly. You can submit questions by clicking on the Q&A icon located on the right-hand side of your screen. Click that icon labeled here with the top arrow. Type your question and click submit. You can jump in there right now if you'd like and let us know where you're joining from. If it's a technical question that you have, I should have an answer for you that will appear on your screen shortly after you submit. You can download a PDF of the slide deck right now by clicking on the handouts icon located on the right-hand side of your screen as well, labeled here with this bottom arrow. Click there and you can download a PDF to take notes if you'd like. Today's webinar is being recorded. You're going to receive a link to that recording in a follow-up email. In that same email from us here at Workforce, you're going to receive your HRCI and SHRM certification codes for today's event. All right, so in today's event, creating a recruiting strategy that embraces change. This is a part 3 of Recruiting for the Future Workforce webinar series that we've done with Cornerstone. We have a couple great speakers with us. First, we have Tim Carlson, President of Blue Water HCM. Tim is responsible for managing Blue Water partner relationships and services, as well as defining and maintaining the products and services Blue Water delivers in support of their customers. Joining Tim is Tom Boyle. Tom is a seasoned product executive who spent the past 20+ years building innovative technologies that change the way people work. His expertise spans all areas of talent management with a focus on talent acquisition in support of large enterprise organizations. So it's our pleasure to have both Tim and Tom with us today. So first things first, I'm going to pass things over to you, Tim.
Thanks so much. Appreciate your time today. Thanks everybody for joining us. Tim Carlson with Blue Water here, and we are excited to be talking to you today about our recruiting strategy that embraces change. Our goal here today is to make sure that as we look at new recruiting strategies, we're also looking at the effect of change on organizations in alignment with those outcomes. So today we'll be looking at aligning your business objectives, and we'll talk a lot about business outcomes as part of our discussion here. We're going to talk about combining different facets of our strategy together to create an integrated approach. We'll talk together about driving adoption of change in your organization, of this particular change around recruiting, and then we'll focus on realizing the value in the organization of your recruiting strategy. Tom and I are going to start out today by talking about some background on change management to lay out the framework for change in your organization. Tom, would you like to say anything before we get started here?
No, I think that's a good start. You know, we'll try and make it as interactive as these can be. And as Alec mentioned earlier, feel free to ask questions throughout, and we'll try and get to as many as possible. So I'm excited to get started.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Tom. All right. One of the things we're going to focus on here continuing today is going to be on readiness, productivity, and adoption of your new recruiting strategy here. When you're out and you're implementing a new process or a new technology, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. You need people to make it work. So our conversation today is going to be talking about people and how they're going to act and react to the change that you have with your new recruiting strategy. There's a lot going on in the environment here, and we'll talk about that today and how that impacts people in order to make this work. When we're talking about change management here, from a background perspective, there's 4 key areas that we're looking at. The first is, what do people need to know? What background and information do they need? Why? The business objectives. What's going to be accomplished? What is it that they're going to need to know in order to make the change that's required? The second area is really around, what do people need to do? The skills and tools that are required. So when you're looking at this, what are the actual behaviors that are going to be taking place as part of this change? What are folks actually going to be doing, and what do they need to do in order to be successful? The third area we'll look at is accountability. So, your traditional RACI matrix in terms of who's accountable and responsible and so on around the structure of that change and what they're going to need to do to accept that accountability. And then finally, we'll talk about motivation. How do we drive the behaviors that we want, and what motivates people to embrace the strategy that we're promoting as part of the change? Just some background here from a change management perspective. Why do we do change management? This slide encompasses the stats here around effective change and poor change. And I know a lot of organizations have either change management groups or change management as part of their strategy, but somewhere along the line, they lose focus on including change as part of that strategy, and they're focusing just on making sure they get the change in, and that the new system is in or the new process is going in, and they forget about the people. And what we're talking about here is human factors, which essentially say that if you focus on change management throughout that process, you're going to increase your opportunity for success in your recruiting strategy.
Yeah, the one that blows me away, and I was going to jump in earlier, but is really, you spoke to it, just that it takes people to make that change work, and it seems like such an obvious statement to make. But the first thing that I talk to clients and existing clients, as well as prospects that are getting ready to go through either an implementation or an upgrade, is exactly that. I talk to them about how it's really going to come down to 49% product and 51% change management, their approach to change management. And so I think the next slide really kind of drives that point home and talks about, I think it's even labeled the benefit, but to me it's really kind of the cost, right? Because what this slide really illustrates, and if you're not familiar with Sierra Cedar, they do some great research, and this is a piece of that. And this really talks to those companies that either embrace it as a core culture, they embrace it just on key projects, sporadically or never, and then it correlates the technology cost to employees from a change management perspective. And so how many times have you walked in and kind of sat down to make those expectations, right? And automatically they're assuming that everything is going to be automated and done for them, right? So it's important that we understand and embrace it from the very beginning so that we can really dissect that and, again, get the most out of our projects. So I think on the next slide, there's probably even a better example of some of the benefits involved with specific to change management. So if you looked at this is by organizational size. So some of you questioning the data as far as whether it's related to small, medium, or large, what you can see here is that not only on the previous slide did you see those companies that embrace that culture of change management, they had a lower cost of technology per employee, but they also are seen more strategically across the board. And again, that's really from a recruiting perspective, from talent acquisition, that's really what we want. We want that strategic seat at the table. And so one of the ways that we can do that is to really embrace change management as we go about implementing our projects. And so this is a great example of that impact across those organizational sizes. And I think on the next slide, we're going to talk more about that continuum, which I thought was really fascinating just from an overall timeline perspective.
Yeah, because this is a process, and at the risk of sounding like Cowboys head coach Jason Garrett, it really is a process that you have to go through, and folks are going to go along this continuum line at different speeds, and you're going to have different people in different parts of the organization and different stakeholder groups be on this continuum change at different times. And so it's critical to remember that your message, as you talk about communication, is going to have to meet multiple needs as you go along this continuum. You're not all going to get there at once. Not everybody needs to get to the same place. And you have to take into consideration the fact that some folks aren't going to get anywhere down the line, and you just want to make sure that you're preventing them from sabotaging your project. That's where you're at. From a recruiting strategy, there are some people that will embrace that change as you go along, and our goal is to help increase the opportunity to embrace that change as we move along. So as we wrap up the background change management stuff here, we've got a traditional change management model here around planning, discovery, and building. We're going to focus in today on a couple of key areas, 4 key areas that are going to allow us to really define some of the key areas which are going to help make a difference from a change perspective in your organization. So as we look at these here, there's 4 key discussion topics that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about planning from the previous slide around the vision. So why are we making the changes that we're making, and what is it that we're trying to accomplish? We're going to talk from the previous slide, discover, when we look at the stakeholder analysis. So, what is happening in each individual group? What's the impact of that vision on each of these stakeholder groups? And then the last 2 areas that we're going to focus on are communications and enablement, and those both relate to build. Okay, we're building a plan, and we have to go execute that plan. And so we'll look at different ways of communicating in organizations, and then finally, how do we get folks ready for the change in that new recruiting strategy? All right. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about the vision. And that vision comes from the fact that there's a lot of change going out there from a recruiting perspective. There's mobile technologies. There's differences in what the workforce looks like from a gig economy and from different organizations, whether they're offshoring or bringing folks back. There's different stakeholder groups that are changing and taking an interest in what we're doing from a talent acquisition and recruiting perspective. Certainly, from a speed perspective, the amount and volume of change that exists in terms of the speed in talent acquisition is truly breathtaking sometimes in terms of the amount of change that you're seeing in the industry. With the economy and different changes that we might be seeing, in terms of some slowing down that we might see from a red-hot economy that we've been having. And then finally, this last piece here, the artificial intelligence, in terms of making a big difference from a predictive standpoint in knowing what we're looking for from a recruiting perspective, it's going to make a large change.
I think that, zeroing in on, more specifically some of those kind of market dynamics that are driving recruiting specifically in working with our clients, not only do you see them in general having a problem filling positions for some of those more specialized skills, but what you also see is companies now trying to come up with a process and solutions that fit, sometimes 4 or 5 generations of work all in the same location. So it's not just 1 or 2, right? We're trying to come up with solutions that fit everyone. And as the market continues to tighten, again, employment being at all-time low, you can see some findings here from Manpower that talk more to the global impact, which is around 45%. I think it's closer to 42 here in the U.S. And even more than that, when you talk to CEOs and you talk to recruiters, what they're telling you and what we're hearing is that skills are changing, right? The skills they're looking for yesterday are not the skills they're looking for today and tomorrow. And so that's not just, a single role like, the autonomous vehicle industry or things like that. It's really impacting every role and every industry. If we were to look inside my house, right, I have some preteens that have decided they're going to take on YouTube, being a YouTuber streamer as a career, which I did not know existed in any form until recently. But that's just a small example, right, of how everything that we're doing is changing. And over the next 3 to 5 years, it will change even more drastically. And what that's really helped to do is it's really helped to create more of a candidate-driven market, right? Candidates are no longer willing to bend over backwards. And the same can be said for employees. If they don't get the opportunity, if they don't have that high-touch technology in front of them, then they'll go elsewhere to get it. And so we know that to be true. And we know that when our technology isn't implemented correctly and the experience is poor, that it can not only have an impact on whether someone applies again, which is the obvious, but it can really have an impact on your organization's bottom line. And so all of these factors really, really put a spotlight on the need for change management and recruiting and doing things a different way, thinking about that journey, right? Thinking about that audience differently than what we have in the past. Instead of worrying about how fast we can go live and what the coolest widget is we can turn on, we need to think about the journey and what those individuals are looking to get from it, right? And in most cases, what we'll find is they're looking for transparency. And so hopefully today we'll start to put a little bit more of a framework in place that'll help you get there. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Tim.
Thanks, Tom. As we go through this, you talked about, candidates looking for a different experience and trying to avoid that negative experience. One of the things that we focus on with our customers is we just want to make sure that those folks are having a great user experience as they're going through. And by that, I'm not even just talking about the technology. I'm talking about this is their first initial view of that organization and what that organization is looking for. So that type of experience is critical because it's leading to some type of business objective that you have. You're not out recruiting people just to recruit people. You're out there because you have specific business objectives that you're trying to accomplish. Whether you're trying to increase your margins or improve efficiency in your organization, or you're managing to a different type of budget, you're focused on how do we increase profitability within the organization. Or you could be recruiting out there and looking at high volume positions, or you could be looking at, high demands because from a revenue standpoint, you're trying to grow your top line revenue, change the size of your organization, or you may be going into new geographies and have needs to staff there. And finally, from a sustainability standpoint, what you're looking for is how do you continue that organization, the profitability and growth in the organization from a sustainability standpoint, looking at revenue, looking at how your organization is developing. And then finally, are your customers coming back to you from a referenceable standpoint? Do you have is your organization sustainable because your customers keep on coming back to you? So those are all different types of business objectives that you'll see that drive your recruiting strategy, and you'll need to make sure that you've got alignment with those as you wind up, as this whole conversation here that we've had recently is about painting that vision. So why are we making the change in the recruiting strategy? What is it that we're trying to do, and how is that going to impact people? Right? So what will there be more of, or what will there be less of? And what is that individual change to people or different groups that's going to impact the organization and impact your ability to be successful with your recruiting change? Here's another thing that we hear from organizations when we're working with them is that they wish they had set that vision in place earlier. So we'll work change management as part of an implementation or a process change. And at first, the client will want to delay the start of that until they know exactly what the change is going to be. But backing up the timeline and backing up and getting in and making sure that change is part of the vision helps to make sure that it's going to be sustainable through the whole implementation of that new process or technology or strategy. So change starts early, it occurs often, and it'll occur throughout the entire implementation process. So that wraps up the vision conversation. I want to talk a little bit about stakeholders and stakeholder analysis. What we want to do here is we want to focus on the different groups that are going to be impacted by the change. So that's different for every different type of change you have in your organization. For recruiting, you have both internal and external stakeholder groups that are part of this. And the external piece outside of your organization can get pretty complicated these days. An applicant coming in to your site and working through maybe some piece of technology that is not yours, it's a vendor's technology. And then you've got people like referrers, and you've got medical backgrounds, and you've got personal background checks, and all different types of integrations that could be part of that process. all of those people might be changing as part of your new recruiting strategy. That's outside your organization. Within your organization, there's recruiters, there's different managers, there's the folks that are doing the interviewing, approvers that are part of the process. Other folks might be, involved in the HR solution or legal or risk management. Those are all different stakeholder groups that could be impacted by your new recruiting strategy. And so we want to make sure that they're all included and thought about when we're building that overall strategy. Here's an impact analysis example in terms of the different types of questions that we want to ask when we're looking at a stakeholder group. I think it's important here to know that this is an artifact that you can take away and understand that there's different areas that we really need to focus on. We talked a little bit about the audiences before, but those audiences might have subgroups too, based on different characteristics of those groups. So your recruiters in Oregon might be different in terms of their needs from the recruiters in Texas. And so we've got community college systems that we work with in each area, and their strategy around identifying their audiences is different. The next piece is the change, impact, and influence. So this is the what is changing, right? And where, how are they impacted? What are key changes? And are there change agents and influencers that are part of the process? We talked earlier about how the fact that everybody's going to be at a different place, and you will have supporters in your organization of this change, and then you'll have folks that are used to doing things the way they're used to doing them. And so we need to identify the different folks in the organization that can help us with this particular change. We'll also talk about benefits and resistance. Resistance in the recruiting area, we run into a lot of challenges with organizations who are used to doing things one way. They've been recruiting in their organization the same way for 5 or 10 years. And they know that there's change out there, but they believe that they've adapted already to what that change needs to be. And so if we introduce a new strategy with new technology or new processes, there's some reluctance or resistance there that they may put up as part of the process to eliminating steps or substituting some piece of technology for a manual process that's going on right now. And then finally, we're going to lay the framework for communication and training. So identifying what's going to help them from an enablement standpoint. And if you remembered earlier, we're talking about what the vision is and the stakeholder components. We'll talk about communication, and that last piece is enablement. So doing this impact analysis allows us to come in and very specifically identify and lay out a process and a plan for during the discovery phase for implementing change in the organization. Okay, so moving on here, we've talked about vision and stakeholders. We'll talk a little bit about communication here. When we've already talked about those internal and external stakeholders, we want to now talk about how the communication needs to be tailored for each of those groups. So first, starting with the internal group, one of the things that we talk about with our clients is making sure that you're using the tool sets that exist in the organization. So in other words, when you're implementing change in that organization, you want to take advantage of the built-in infrastructure that might exist. So if you have community pages or cohorts or specific groups that are used to communicating a certain way, we want to take advantage of those particular built-in accommodations that exist from a communication standpoint already, rather than necessarily recreating something or creating some new path or venue for that communication that they're not going to know where to go or where to get that particular information. We want to make it as current and as in the current process as they're used to. which is different from an external standpoint where you have less control over the situation and you need to clearly define your message and you only get one big chance for impact. We talked a little bit earlier about user experience and what that first impact is going to look like. That communication that you do with it from an external standpoint has to be clean, and you don't have as much opportunity to direct folks. So you've got to make sure that they can get in, do the work that they need to do, and make sure that their communication chain is from start to finish is very clean and clear. Finally, one of the things that we find with organizations is that even though things are posted internally and externally, the communication areas mix. So in other words, your external communication it could impact your internal communication and vice versa. So you just have to make sure when you're looking at those channels that you're using channels that can be used both ways, even though some might be more effective to the internal or external audience as you're making the change. So that communication and those communication plans are all about driving adoption. And Tom's going to talk a little bit here about adoption and how we can be effective with implementing that change.
Yeah, perfect. And if we go back a slide, I think what's intriguing to me on that one as well is I was wondering if you might be able to maybe we could dive in and provide a couple practical examples, because I think the tendency, especially when you're going through a change, right? Everyone, a lot of the clients that I work with, right, there's a reluctancy to communicate externally more so than internally, right? Because externally they feel like it's an exposure, it's an admittance of guilt, right? They didn't have something and they're getting something or something of the like. Can you talk a little bit about some of the more specific strategies you've seen clients deploy when it comes to the external side of communication versus internal to kind of help get over that fear a little bit?
Sure. I think the most important thing, Tom, is being clear and transparent, right? Now, being clear and transparent doesn't mean just we were doing this wrong and now we're doing it right. It means telling a story in the packaged appropriate way, right? So those press releases or those using different job boards or using your Career Center page off of your own recruiting site, all those different ways are different ways that you can attract attention to what you're trying to do. When you have an airline that is going through difficult times as part of their business operations, that impacts what they're doing from a recruiting standpoint. But that doesn't mean that it has to shut it down. It simply means that that's a new opportunity for them to create a new energy and a new focus for the new group of recruits that they've got. So you can build positive attention even around difficult situations.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good example. And as I was thinking through that, I was actually thinking through a specific client that actually they used some of the corporate events that they had going on in their community. They used that as the catalyst to launch their new site. And so for them, it was kind of fresh, new social content. And so they kind of used all of that to drive that. So that might be another idea. So that's great. Awesome. So let's talk a little bit about adoption, right? I think that's the big kind of scary word. And as someone that's been on the technology side of this and worked with a lot of different clients, the worst thing that I want to see going into a client that's looking at new technology is they're in a situation where they're using 30% of the functionality that they have, right? And a lot of that is because they thought about it one time. Maybe the people that originally selected it and implemented it are long gone, right? The product has since been upgraded and moved along, and innovations have happened. However, the client has failed to upgrade those. So again, back to some of this research, the biggest thing to me that was kind of eye-opening was really that only 10% of the organizations are measuring how the technology is adopted. And so one, I would question if they're getting the maximum out of it. And two, with such a low percentage measuring it, I would question what they're measuring it on. And so I think that's a big part of change management, right? You have to be able to set those goals up front. And what I wanted to bring in here from that same piece of research is just talks through, more specifically what's happening when recruiting, but overall talent management. And you can see the level of adoption among small, medium, and large organizations. And so again, this is actually higher than I thought it would be. But if you're looking for a benchmark in terms of where you are technology-wise on that kind of implementation and adoption scale, this is a great place to kind of use as that benchmark. So feel free to download this. And obviously the full report has even more data. But across recruiting, you can see the average almost 79% adoption, which is, again, higher than I think a lot of the clients that I work with are probably closer to that 73%. But it doesn't surprise me that the enterprise clients are much higher. Anything surprise you in this, Tim, as you were kind of looking over the findings here?
Not so much. The recruiting piece actually wasn't as big of a surprise to me. And the reason I say that is folks have to recruit, right?
Yeah.
They have to go out and do that. And if they're going to bring the talent in the organization, they're always going to be constantly bringing in talent in an organization. So you look at the difference of that versus things like succession management or even learning in an organization. The learning that you might see might simply be compliance driven instead of being developmental driven, right?
Yeah.
And so you may just be, forcing people to go to a site, they go in twice a year and take their learning and they're done. Well, obviously there's huge opportunity there from a learning perspective to help them grow from a personal development standpoint. But when you look at recruiting, they've got to bring folks in. And so they're going to be adopting technology, and not that the technology itself is going to solve all of their problems. There's still stuff that's going to have to be done from a manual perspective, but we want to make that, as
yeah, I mean, it's a good sign of an investment, an acknowledgement,
exactly.
right, that they have to tackle that. And I think that diving into that topic, right, I think recruiting could be defined as a lot of things when it comes to adoption, right? In terms of, is it just having a career site and being able to accept jobs online, or is it much deeper than that, right? And so
sure.
What we know is to really get that value out of solutions, you've got to think more thoroughly around what you're trying to accomplish from a business outcome and work your way backwards from there. So good adoption data.
Good. Thanks. So we'll talk here. There we go. The final focus area that we want to talk about today is enablement. And that enablement comes from what the specific needs of a stakeholder group are. And you're going to see quite the continuum of what you're going to be able to use as part of that enablement process. I'm actually going to start out in the middle here with the guided process. We've been talking about technology and adoption. When you look at a system or a solution technology, it's got to be pretty straightforward, and it's got to guide folks through the process that they're going to be using. You can't have a help guide for somebody that's recruiting, that somebody's filling out an application. They need to be able to go in and do it and know what to do simply from the workflow. So you want to build in, as part of your change, where do we have to have that critical user experience where somebody's going to be able to handle things on their own through that technology queue and manage to get all the information that they need, as opposed to relying on some other type of, hey, take this training in order to go ahead and fill out your application. That's not going to work. As you split out here and you move along, different folks might be able to use job aids, those supplemental tools, in order to support the change that they need. So a lot of times we'll do job aids with managers. We'll send them some information and give them information around, from a hiring perspective, how they're going to utilize a site or how they're going to utilize a process in order to be effective as part of the recruiting process. You can send them things like, your questions might be in your system, but how you go ahead and do that interviewing process, you get the support there, so just so that they can feel comfortable. There may be folks that are more intricately involved in that process. So the folks that are actually running recruiting in your organization, where you want to do some formal training, or you might do train the trainer, where you're walking folks through the entire process so that they can see end to end. And you also get the opportunity to build that communication between them. So it's not just knowing what to do, but it's knowing why they're doing it. And that type of information that's built into the communication in a training class, you can't necessarily trade that out for, you get to control that message a lot better. And so you don't want to miss out on that opportunity. From a feedback perspective, clearly we don't always get it right the first time. It's a continuous process here to increase the amount of communication that we're getting back from folks so that we know how to change what we're doing. And then finally, we want to make sure that we're measuring our outcomes here and making sure that we're looking both from a operational aspect about how quickly we're moving folks through a process or how successfully we're moving them through a process versus how we want to, the business results that we're getting, and are we achieving what we want. So we've talked here for a while in terms of trying to make this as practical as possible, and there are different areas that we've talked about that you have some takeaways that you'll be able to use in terms of creating a vision and understanding why that vision is important to your overall process, how those success metrics are tied in to your business objectives, going in and looking at those stakeholders and doing an impact analysis and being able to really focus on that process there of analyzing what's going on with those specific stakeholders and all the different aspects of the characteristics of that stakeholder group and how they're going to help you and what information they're going to need to be successful. Going through and building a communication plan, building a training plan from an enablement perspective, and then understanding from a performance standpoint what you've actually, what you're accomplishing with your tools. So here we have a set of tools, and from here, you want to make sure that they're just incorporated into your overall technology strategy. And then finally here, our entire conversation has been geared toward making sure that you're reaching your specific goals. So with that strategy, you can come in and make sure that it's tailored and that you're communicating your vision appropriately to reach your profitability, growth, or sustainability goals. So the ultimate process here is that we've made a difference with that recruiting strategy because we included change from the very start of the overall process, and we've increased our likelihood for success in achieving the goals that we set out to accomplish. Tom, do you have some comments before we open this up for questions?
No, I'm excited to see if we had any questions come through.
All right. If you have a question for either of our speakers today, if we're ready to do this, you can click on the Q&A icon located on the right-hand side of your screen, type your question in, and click submit. It looks like we don't have any in here right now, so we'll give it some time for a couple to roll in, guys.
Looks like I had one that was chatted over to me around size of you mentioned back on slide 20, I think it was, I'm looking at the deck right, around the impact analysis and the different team members that should be involved. Can you talk to just general, I think it's easy the tendency on, with some of these is to definitely want to invite everyone. Can you talk about maybe the ideal size and structure of those teams? I know, we'd kind of recommended some key roles. Is that one in those roles? Is that multiple in those roles? Can you talk to what you've seen kind of work in the ideal scenario, Tim?
Yeah, sure, Tom. That's a great question. And I guess I wouldn't be a good consultant if I didn't say it depends, right? Because it really does depend on the organization that you're working with. So a recruiting strategy is not the first and only change that you're going to have in an organization. You're going to be focused on, there's change is constant in an organization, and you're going to be used to using different teams in order to accomplish your specific goals. So when we're looking at those specific teams, you have to make a determination around how are things usually communicated in those organizations, who are the decision makers, and what type of command and control organization you're working with. So if you're working with an organization where from a top-down perspective, they're used to taking on initiatives and making the change in the organization and viewing instructions as just as such as marching orders and moving forward, then you can have a different size group than if you have a very distributed organization where you need to get a lot more consensus building in as part of the process, and you'll need to focus on getting more buy-in and making that change a little bit slower in the organization. So, I would say it depends on your organization and how they typically manage change. But those, you could have, any number of, 4 to 6 distinct groups if you can manage it straightforward, or you could have 10 to 20 groups that you really need to closely manage because they're going to have an impact on that change.
Yeah, I think that's a great perspective. It looks like this individual person has a corporate office and then like 3 regional locations. And so I think to your point, right, you want to make sure that you have some stakeholder involvement from those areas. But, my experience has been, make sure that you're making some core business decisions that benefit everyone before bringing in, all the individual stakeholders to drive their decisions across that domain.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, Tom. And I'd take it one step further, though, is if they're viewed as part of the process, you have a better opportunity for them to accept the change, right? Even if we know that we're going to have the right amount of input from that group and it should be similar to what we're seeing in other groups, if they have the opportunity to be part of those groups of teams that are defining that information, you're more likely to say, hey, because, Javier was part of that group, we can rely on him and we know he's got some value as part of the input to that process, so we trust that this is the right process and our voices have been heard, even if that information isn't different.
Yeah, and I think that you're right. I think that comes back to it's getting buy-in and adoption, right? If you can get buy-in and adoption and get wins early in the process, I think that goes a long way to some of the traditional folks that might have resistance in the process too, right?
I would agree with that. Yep.
Any other questions, Alec?
We don't have any in here, so if we want, we can give it a little bit more time, or we can shut things down here and give our attendees and everybody on the line a little bit of their day back. So thank you, Tim and Tom, for being with us. We really appreciate you taking the time to be here. And thank you to Cornerstone for sponsoring this event and this 3-part series that we've done over the course of the past month and a half. I also want to thank everybody on the line. Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed the webinar, please take the time to fill out our post-event survey, which is going to appear right as this webinar ends. Your feedback is very important to us. This is our last workforce webinar of 2018. So any feedback does help us improve our events moving forward in 2019. So thanks to everybody on the line. We'll see you all back here for our next, actually, like I said, this is our last workforce webinar of the year. So please go ahead and keep your eyes on workforce.com/webinars for information on upcoming events in 2019. Thanks again, everybody, and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.